All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to our webinar today, speaking with your financial aid counselor. My name is Jonathan Sparling, and I'm an Associate Director of College Planning and Education here at MEFA. I've been with MEFA for a little over 6 months now. Prior to that, I had a role working with another nonprofit organization to help students plan and save and pay for college, as well as learn a little bit about personal finance. And before that, I spent some time working on a college campus in the financial aid office. For those of you who are new to MEFA or who do not know just a little bit about who we are, we're the not-for-profit state authority created in 1982. Really, our mission and our goal is to help families plan, save, and pay for college. There's a lot of ways that you can continue to connect with MEFA beyond just this webinar. MEFA.org is our website, so we would encourage you to go there and to just host of information, blogs, tools, resources, all about planning for college, paying for college, savings for college, not in that order, but just a real good variety of resources for you to take advantage of. If you do have any questions about the college planning process, you can certainly give us a call. We do have college planning expertise in-house, and we have folks who will be able to answer phone calls for you. We have a social media presence, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, so certainly feel free to follow us on each one of those platforms. For those of you who are not signed up for our emails, you can certainly do so as well. Sign up at MEFA.org. We'll send you tips and updates by email, just with a host of different relatable topics. We time those emails so they kind of follow the college planning and savings timeline, so you'll be getting relevant and timely information. We host various seminars throughout the Commonwealth. For more details on those, you can visit MEFA as well. We do, in the fall, we do college financing seminars, and in the spring, we do a variety of seminars, one about after the college acceptance and what you can expect next. We also have a few different admissions seminars that we host in conjunction with professionals throughout the industry. And then obviously we have these webinars. So if you like what you hear today, then hopefully you will come to another one. If you've come to one before, welcome back. And certainly we welcome you to attend all of these. So before we jump into the agenda, I just want to remind folks that we do have a handout, and so you can actually download the handout. It will be it's a copy of the PowerPoint slides in a PDF version, so you can download that and just have for your records. If you do have any questions, everyone is on mute, but if you do have any questions, you can certainly feel free to add them in the chat panel. I'll be monitoring that as we go throughout the webinar. But if you do have any questions towards the end and you want to save them, I can take folks off mute and we can have a conversation and kind of go from there. Other than that, I believe that we are ready to go. And so kind of what our agenda here today, again, this webinar is speaking with your financial aid office. We're going to start by just defining what is the financial aid office. This will be a review for most of you, but if you're new to this, your son or daughter or you are going through this for the first time, we'll just review what is the financial aid office. We'll talk about what are some reasons you may contact them. And then, something new that we're doing with this webinar, because it is something that, I think you can get a lot of value from a firsthand perspective. We actually have with us today Shannon Booten, who is a financial aid counselor at Suffolk University. And so after we kind of set the framework, set the background, Shannon and I will enter into just a conversation where I'm going to ask Shannon some questions about, contacting the financial aid office and some of her experience that she'll share. So most of the webinar will be focused on that conversation with Shannon and myself. We'll end with some final thoughts, and then, as I mentioned, we'll take any questions at the end. So let's jump right in. What is the financial aid office? So the financial aid office is the office responsible for determining students' financial aid. And so if you are going through this for the first time, we're now January 24th. So if your son or daughter is planning to enroll for next fall, then you've probably had some experience and had some contact with the financial aid office already. But a lot of times as families are going through this college admissions process for the first time, they're really starting that work with the admissions office first, obviously, to get accepted to the school, and then they're transitioning over to the financial aid office. Sometimes it will happen as an overlap, but really the financial aid office is that office responsible for determining student financial aid. It is different than the admissions office, which, as I mentioned, is the office that many students and families work with first. Depending on the institution, it might have a different name or various names. So a common example of this is student financial services. So really it's the offices, their functionalities might be a little bit different. They might do have more expansive functionality. They might do a little bit more, but financial aid office, student financial services, they might even go by some other names, maybe some extended names, but it's the office that you are submitting those financial aid forms to, that FAFSA, maybe that CSS profile, and they are the ones who are reviewing the students for any financial aid eligibility. And in many institutions, they do work closely with the admissions office. This is something you'll see at both public and private institutions where the admissions office and the financial aid office work very closely because, again, they're all on the enrollment side. So what is required by the financial aid office? There are, these are kind of the major forms to complete. So most of you are probably familiar with the FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. So this is the form that you are required to complete to be reviewed for financial aid at all institutions or many institutions that you'll be applying to. There are some that don't use federal funds to fund their operations, but those are few and far in between. So almost every institution that you apply to will require the FAFSA form. Less frequent will be the CSS profile. This is a form that's required by a lot of private colleges and universities. The CSS profile is a little bit longer. It asks some different information versus the FAFSA form. Schools have the ability to add their own personal questions in that form. If you're not sure if a school that you're applying to requires it, you can check the school's financial aid website. You could also go out to the College Board as well, which is the entity that oversees the CSS profile, and they will have some information as well. Beyond those two forms there, the FAFSA and the CSS profile, some institutions will require what's called verification documents. Verification is the process where the aid office verifies the information that you submitted on the FAFSA to be accurate. And so some common documents that they might ask for would be a tax transcript or a tax return now. And so if that is required by the financial aid office, just make sure that you provide that to them in as timely a fashion as you can. And then there are some institutions that will require additional institutional financial aid forms. These are less common, especially for first-year students or entering students for the first time. But again, just something to be aware of. There might be that one additional form. Really, the major form is the FAFSA form, and at the schools that do use the CSS profile as well. So we'll get into this a little bit and more later on, but I think this is a good slide just to show you kind of what happens with the financial aid process. So when you submit the FAFSA and the CSS profile, that information is processed. The data is sent to the selected colleges and state financial aid offices. So when you submit the FAFSA, if you do it online, which most of you will, as well as the CSS profile, that information is processed and it's sent to the college that you indicate on those forms. And the FAFSA data is also sent to the state financial aid office to see if you might qualify for any state financial aid. Families will receive a FAFSA confirmation. It's called the student aid report. That's going to be sent to the student or families once they complete that. And so that's kind of what's happening up top. And then, these bottom two just show a little bit more of a breakdown of specifically what's happening in some next steps. So as I mentioned, the college and universities are going to receive that information electronically. They're going to utilize that reported information to determine the financial aid eligibility. So again, the financial aid office is using the information you put on the FAFSA or the CSS profile to determine the financial aid eligibility. And then they're going to mail or email the financial aid award package or letter to the applicant. And so this is kind of a fluid process. If you've been accepted to some institutions, you may have already received your financial aid award. But if you haven't yet, then it kind of happens on an ongoing basis or a rolling basis. Some other things that you should do as an applicant, student and families, always review that data that you submitted. We always say an extra 0 reporting in income can make a big difference. So just check to make sure that what you put on those forms is indeed accurate. If you need to make corrections, you can log back in and update your FAFSA. If CSS profile corrections are needed, you're going to want to contact the college directly. And then, as I mentioned earlier, students and families should be on the lookout for additional documentations to provide to the college. So before I get into the conversation with Shannon, just some reasons that you may contact the financial aid office. And again, we're going to talk about this in depth in just a few minutes. So, just some common reasons to contact the financial aid or aid office. If you have some confusion or you're unclear which forms are required, most institutions are really good about putting that information right on their website or kind of sending it out to you in email. But if you are still confused or unclear which forms are required, that might be a reason why you want to contact the financial aid office. If there's misreported information on forms, and specifically this is going to be on the CSS profile, on that FAFSA form, you can actually log back into your account and update that information, and the school will receive an updated copy of that FAFSA information. If there are some changes in financial circumstances, and this is where a lot of families are contacting the institution. So if you're completing those forms in October or November, and come February or March, there's a significant change in financial circumstances that could warrant a reason to reach out to the financial aid office. And lastly, you might just be contacting them to introduce yourself. So, just saying hi and so kind of who you are. I think that, again, a lot of families are working with the admissions office to start, and that's great, and you're going to continue to work with them. But really, you'll probably have more contact with the financial aid office once you enroll and, into your sophomore, junior, and senior year. And so some, more questions to ask the financial aid office and some specific things. A lot of this, again, will be published on the school's website or even published on the financial aid award package when you do receive it. But, one question is what is included in the COA? COA equals cost of attendance, broken down by billed costs and incidentals. So just kind of determining specifically what's in that cost of attendance. Another kind of common question is, are there merit-based scholarships? If the student did not receive a merit-based scholarship in the freshman award, is it possible to still apply? Some institutions will award merit-based scholarships, again, just based on meritorious achievements of the student in high school. And so just checking to see if the college does offer that, because again, not all colleges will. Just checking on conditions such as grade point average, enrollment status, or majors to renew scholarships for each year. Another popular question or one that we hear from families a lot is, how does the college treat outside scholarships in the financial aid package? So the financial aid office is reviewing you for financial aid eligibility, but you on your own, your son or daughter might be applying through private entities to get some outside scholarships. So just asking the aid office, how do they treat those outside scholarships? And then the last one is, how can I appeal my financial aid award, which I think is probably one of the reasons why folks are here today, to talk more about, what warrants that situation, what's the best approach for kind of getting in front of an aid officer and speaking with someone in the aid office. And so again, it's going to be a little bit different at each institution. So before I start the conversation with Shannon and turn it over to that, does anyone have any questions? I'm going to leave everyone on mute right now, but if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat panel right now. All right. So I don't see any questions, but I'll continue to monitor that. So I would, as I mentioned, we wanted to bring someone who is a practicing financial aid counselor to this webinar. So Shannon, thank you for coming.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Shannon, before we begin, would you just mind talking a little bit about your professional and personal background in financial aid?
Absolutely. So I graduated from Bridgewater State in 2014. During my time as an undergraduate, I did use a combination of all types of aid, institutional aid, federal aid, and private loans as well. So I'm still very familiar with the student perspective on the financial aid process. After I graduated, my first job was with Whitworth Institute of Technology in Boston. I acted as a Student Service Center representative, which is a part of another word that could be used for a financial aid office. I then accepted a role as a financial aid counselor, primarily with undergraduate students, and I'm now with Suffolk University working mainly with graduate students. So I have a very different background with graduate and undergraduate, and I still do remember the process of being a student, which I like to refer to when working with families and students.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. So, Shannon, I know we have a lot of families going through this process for the first time. And we talked about it a little bit, but could you, take a couple minutes to explain the financial aid process and what families can expect from that?
Sure thing. So this is a more recent update, but the FAFSA is available October 1st. So like Jonathan had previously mentioned, for families where students are looking to enroll for the fall 2019 semester, you do want to have that FAFSA filled out. The sooner the better. Some institutions do have first come, first serve aid, so you do want to make sure you have that information submitted as soon as that becomes available. Once you submit the FAFSA, you do pick the schools that you want the information to be sent to. Every school does have a different timeline of when they do send out their award packages, but most schools will send out first merit-based aid through the admissions office with your acceptance letter, and then a follow-up letter based on the school's timeline with the remaining financial aid package, which would include your eligibility based on the FAFSA. After that point, you kind of take that information, look at the cost of the different schools, and make your decision and deposit later in May to determine what school the student will be enrolling in.
Perfect, perfect. Yeah, and so, as we talked about, it's definitely it's a fluid process. It's happening kind of in conjunction with the admissions process, but, it really ramps up kind of now, or even, it really does ramp up. So, perfect. So, for families going through this again for the first time, where can they find information about their financial aid counselor? Does each college or university assign a specific counselor? How does all that work?
Absolutely. So most schools do assign specific counselors. It's normally based off of your initial of your last name. That's how most schools separate it. When students are accepted into the institution, every school does have a different process, but most times in your acceptance letter or in your financial aid letter that's sent after, it will have your specific counselor with contact information. So when you get your financial aid letter, you can review it and say, okay, well, I have more questions. Here's the individual that will be overseeing my account. If for some reason you have an issue with getting your financial aid letter, pretty much all schools on their website under the tuition and aid page will have the list of counselors separated by the initial of the last name, so you can find it on there as well. And if you're having issues finding it with all of those different ways, you can always just call the financial aid center and just say, this is the last name, who is my counselor, and they could easily connect you with that individual. So it happens in all different ways, but I think the most straightforward is just to go to the school's website, the tuition and aid portion, and all the counselors will be listed.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And so, you kind of alluded to it already, but if families are looking to get in touch with let's say the family knows who their aid officer is, if they're looking to get in touch with them, it could be a combination of maybe an email, a phone call.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we, every counselor has a different preference, but I feel like the best way to approach it is to probably email your counselor directly, maybe set up a specific time to speak with the student's information so that the counselor can then look up the student's account, have access to their financial aid information so that when you do have a phone call or an appointment later on, they have all of that background information so that you can easily just jump into it. And if they need to look up something, if maybe you don't even have the aid, it hasn't been processed, if they can look that up beforehand, they can then contact you, get it processed, then when you do have that further conversation, you have everything you need, rather than making a couple phone calls back and forth. You have one really productive one.
That's great. That's great. And yeah, that's such a good point about the, because it's busy, right? It's busy in the aid office, and there's obviously the caseload.
And for the families at that time.
And for and everyone's kind of busy, and so I think it's, anything that families can do to kind of set up an appointment, kind of get on the books or on the calendar, and so everyone's kind of prepared with information.
Absolutely. And they have enough time to get all their questions answered, and nothing's interrupted that. So.
Right. All right, perfect. So let's pretend, and I think a key draw of this webinar is that kind of getting in there and speaking with the financial aid counselor. So let's pretend a student or family or both has a meeting scheduled to talk with their financial aid counselor. Either from your experience or what you've heard from colleagues before, families come in and speak with you. What should they be prepared with when starting a conversation? Should they have certain documentation, information on hand? How?
Absolutely. So kind of what I was saying before, if you are going to come in and sit down with a counselor, maybe just touch base with them through email or the phone before, especially for those families who are thinking that they will want to do a special circumstance because they've had a change in finances. That counselor can then send you those specific documents you need to fill out so you can come to the office with them and you can review it with the counselor rather than getting handed those papers and having to go back, fill them out, and then come back again. So maybe just let your counselor know beforehand the specifics of your meeting so that they can help you prepare. So have those additional forms you might need. And then also, I always recommend that the family has the award letter in front of them so that they can kind of go through it line by line. The award letter for a lot of families can maybe not be the most straightforward. They're not used to seeing that information, so to have that with the student's ID as well, I think is very important. And then if you filled out your FAFSA, but you just feel like maybe you filled out something incorrectly or there was a section that you weren't sure about, you can print that out, highlight those sections, and bring it in. But I definitely think if you touch base with the counselor beforehand, they can be really specific about what material would be beneficial to bring in.
Perfect. And yeah, I think since folks are going in and since families are going in with so many, a variety of circumstances, I think that's a really great point to kind of, in that initial conversation with the counselor, whether through email or phone, just asking specifically, in addition to what you mentioned, the award letter, I think is great, having, if families want to kind of print out the FAFSA and highlight certain sections, but even just having that conversation with the counselor before and saying, like, what specifically you need. I know sometimes if it is a financial appeal, they might ask for potentially kind of a listing of your expenses and kind of.
There can be quite a few forms that come with appealing financial aid. That's why I just think it's so beneficial for families to have that information beforehand and they can come in with the actual document so it's not this ongoing back and forth process.
Right. Good. Perfect. So obviously you have experience speaking with students and families about their financial aid, whether it's just a conversation in your office or through email. How do those conversations typically go, and what are some things that you usually talk about?
Absolutely. So for incoming families, the conversation normally, a lot of families just want to go over what the specific awards mean, what the requirements are to maintain each, will it renew next year, questions like that. Popular one is also just, is there a possibility for me to get more financial aid? And then just kind of where do we go from here? We have this financial aid letter in front of us. What are the next steps? So that's really the conversation for incoming families. But as a student moves through the college experience, those conversations can obviously evolve over time. But that's normally those are the big themes for conversations with incoming families.
Good, good. And so you hit on one that I think we hear a lot, and I think families are thinking about a lot. For those families that might be looking for additional financial aid after receiving their initial package, in your experience, and obviously it varies from college to college, but what do colleges usually look for when considering an appeal? And better yet, how should families appeal? Should they write a letter? Should they look for a form? Like, how does that process work?
I definitely want to emphasize the fact that it varies from school to school. All schools have a different level of funding, so there might be some schools that just need a simple, an email saying we really want to come here, can we have more aid? And they could potentially provide that for you, but there are other schools where the process is a little bit more specific. I definitely think the family should contact the counselor, like I said, through phone or email first, and then most schools do have kind of a couple different versions of appeals. You could have an appeal where a family member lost their job, so a special circumstance where the financial situation for the family changed. Every school will have their set of documents that they'll have that family fill out. There are some schools that also want to know if you were awarded a lot more aid at a competing school. So they would want to see your official award letters from other schools and work with admissions to determine if you could qualify for more merit funding. So the process is very different depending on what school you're working with, but I think just having that initial email or phone call with the counselor should be very well versed in what the steps are moving forward. And if you explain your situation, they can tell you, okay, that special circumstance appeal wouldn't apply to you, but maybe you should consider appealing for more merit. So rather than going through 5 different steps, they can really narrow it down for you. So definitely just reach out to the financial aid department, and they can work with you on which appeal and then what the process will be moving forward.
And I think too, and that's great advice, and it's so true. Each school has their own process and their own awarding parameters and just funds to give to families. And I think another thing too to think about is timing, right? So
absolutely.
So right now it's January 24th. Most colleges it's a May 1st decision deadline, and so on the family side, dealing with submitting applications and going through and comparing packages and deciding where to go. But in the aid office, it's processing initial awards, but then also looking at appeals.
And then trying to get that information.
And then trying to get that information.
So that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up, because the financial aid office really does want to give the families the most updated information they can so they can make an informed decision. So if you know now that our situation is dramatically different, this FAFSA does not reflect where we are now, once you get that financial aid letter, or even a little bit before, reach out to the schools that the student's really interested in and start putting together those documents so that once that award letter is received, you can make that appointment and submit those documents, because it does take some time to review, especially if you're trying to appeal your federal aid, which is a whole different thing. We don't have to get to do.
Right.
But it is a very time-consuming process, so reaching out as soon as possible, I highly recommend.
Perfect, yeah. So this is kind of a little shift, but I think it's relatable because obviously in speaking with families, so there's reasons that families will come to you and go to financial aid counselors and to aid offices in general, but what do you, or is there anything that you wish families would call you more about? And so maybe beyond what we've already mentioned, are there any topics or things that you wish families would?
Absolutely. So currently at Suffolk, one of my main responsibilities is I certify all the alternative loans for all students. So I get the loan applications, and I work with families and students, and I feel like a lot of times the families and students, when applying for the loan, didn't really know things about loan periods and that they weren't really sure about the amount. So then I get that information. It's not what the family originally wanted. So I would love it, and I think most financial aid departments would feel the same way, if when families do decide, okay, we're going to go with this lender, but we don't know what the loan period is, this application isn't really, you know, making a lot of sense to us, just reach out, because we would love to clarify those pieces of information so that when the school does get permission to certify your loan, they're doing it correctly so that you can start off the year with your loan correctly on your account, and, you know, the stress is taken care of. So just little things like that that come up in the process that I think families don't realize that we're here to walk you through those steps to make sure you have the correct information.
Perfect. And just as a quick aside, for any folks listening that might not be familiar, alternative loans are basically educational loans that you can borrow on top of what you receive from the financial aid office. You fill out
a separate application for that, and I think that can be an overwhelming process, especially for incoming families. And the financial aid office is very familiar with that process, and we're here to help with your questions about those applications.
Perfect. Excellent. So we've kind of, you know, gone through a lot here and kind of talked about why families appeal, what they should be prepared with, kind of the process and how it goes, and you know, what are some other things that aid offices, in particular, you know, through your experience, might wish that families would ask more about. So, you know, any final words of advice or wisdom for families who are preparing to have a conversation with the financial aid office, or even just kind of thinking about those next steps?
Absolutely. So I definitely think it's really important for families and students to do a little bit of research before they come sit down with us. Not that we don't love answering all of your questions. It's just I feel like to have that base of knowledge will make it so that what we're telling you isn't incredibly overwhelming. There's no worse feeling for a financial aid counselor when a family leaves and you can just see them looking so overwhelmed. So just to have that base, I think is really beneficial. And then also to know the cost of the school, and to look at the cost in comparison with your financial aid, and then come to us and ask, okay, I see this balance, is that correct? And what are my options for paying it after? And then I think the most important piece of advice I have is to really make sure the student is involved. The student is going to enroll in the school, so that's going to be who the school contacts. It will not be the payer of the bill. It will not be the parent listed. It's going to be the student. So I think it's very important for them to be sitting down with you and reviewing the information and meeting the counselor and knowing that process. So it's not just on you. And when the student is communicating with the financial aid office, they feel comfortable relaying the information to you and asking us questions, because they are the student, and it's going to be their account that we are reviewing. That's great.
And I think that's a great way to kind of end it there. Yeah, you know, I think it's definitely a family process, and we know that, but definitely having the student involved is key. So excellent. Well, Shannon, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So again, if there's any questions, you know, we'll continue to take them as we kind of finish up here. We just have a few final slides, but any questions about anything that we've covered so far, certainly feel free to add them into the question panel. But you can also add them into the chat panel as well. So just some final thoughts here. You know, obviously this webinar was intended to focus on conversations with speaking with your financial aid counselor, which, you know, hopefully you're feeling a little more prepared, or hearing from someone who's on the other side. You know, you're feeling a little bit more prepared after that, knowing what you should bring and kind of the process and how that works. We did want to just end with this slide, and this might not be necessarily what you're talking about your financial aid counselor with, although some of these might come up, some of these talking points. But we thought it was good just to add this, because we are talking about the financing side of college, just to add this as a nice roundup here. So, you know, just some other financial considerations to think about as you are deciding where your son or daughter is going to be enrolling in school. You know, for families, especially considering the number of children you will send to college, you know, college is very much a family decision. And so if you are helping to cover some of the costs, then thinking about not only this first child or second child, but if you have other children, and if you are taking on some debt, what you feel reasonably comfortable doing. In the same vein, thinking in terms of total enrollment, so it's 4+ years and total debt. I think a lot of times we get focused on just the first year, but really it is for some. If you're at an associate's degree, it's only 2 years, but if you are at a public 4-year or private 4-year, you're looking at those 4 years at least of enrollment for costs. And so just make sure that you are, factoring that into the budget and being realistic about that. Thinking about the post-graduation monthly loan payment. So again, if students are borrowing direct loans through the federal government, and or if you're borrowing any alternative loans, what are those monthly loan payments going to look like? There's a host of repayment calculators out there where you can kind of plug in numbers and get an idea. Aligning potential starting salary for intended career. So I know a lot of students go in undecided and things change as they go on, but just having kind of an idea, if students have an idea of what they might want to do, cross-comparing what that might be, and if they are borrowing, what is that starting salary for the intended career? Is the student considering graduate school? So obviously Shannon's working with graduate students now, and unfortunately, unlike a lot of undergraduate programs that will offer some institutional money, there's a lot less institutional funds, grants and scholarships, the kind of the gift aid, the good aid at the graduate level. A lot of it is borrowing through a Grad Plus loan, as well as a direct loan for graduate students. So not only thinking about that undergraduate experience, but also that graduate experience, and if they are thinking about graduate school, what the implications will be from a borrowing perspective. Shannon, mentioned this kind of alternative loans, talking about alternative loans, just knowing your credit score if you plan to borrow a private loan, because again, a lot of those private and alternative loans will be driven by a credit score or debt to income ratio. So even in order to get approved for that, just knowing what your credit score is and making sure that it's as good as it can be. And then, finally, comparing each school's net price after financial aid offers are received. Shannon talked about knowing the cost of attendance at an institution, critical, important, but even thinking on top of that is knowing that your cost of attendance is one aspect, and really that net price. So that net price is going to be, what are you paying basically after any financial aid has been applied, because that's really where you're going to have more of an apples to apples comparison. So don't necessarily compare the sticker price of institutions. The sticker price is the published price, but really, what is that net price? What are you going to pay as a family after any financial aid has been applied? And that's certainly, I think a conversation that sometimes folks will have in the aid office, just walking families through specifically, what are the different types of aid that they're receiving and what they can expect from a borrowing perspective. So what can you do now? You can continue to, you can sign up for MEFA emails. We'd love for you to do that, and so you can get updates about any webinars that are coming or any other events that we're doing. If you have not applied, if you have not completed the FAFSA form, both you and your student should get an FSA ID first before you even do the FAFSA. So the FSA ID is basically how you will access and electronically sign the FAFSA. So we encourage you to do that. If you go to FAFSA.gov, there's a link to get an FSA ID right off that. So we always say to get that now, because if you go out and complete the FAFSA, you can't technically complete it until you have that FSA ID. Make sure you're researching deadlines and required applications. So we're coming up on Feb 1. I know with a lot of institutions that might be a regular decision deadline from the admission standpoint, and there might be some financial aid deadlines as well built into that. Some schools do have a Feb 1 deadline on the FAFSA side and potentially the CSS profile. Sign up for any upcoming webinars and then start, and I would say come close to completing those applications that we outlined earlier. So that is all that we have today. I want to thank everyone who was able to attend today's webinar. For anyone who's going to be listening this on playback, thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'll take folks off mute if you have any other questions. Shannon is here as well, so we can stick around and answer any questions. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your day.